Hi and welcome to LVB Show. My name is Salvaro and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I want to say thank you so much to everyone who's listening to the show in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. We have some new listeners in Australia. Hello to them as well. And tonight the interview for me is very exciting because I love traveling. Since I have been legally blind, I have done 3 trips to the United States from Colombia alone using my cane Mr. Magoo. And the experience is fascinating. I love airplanes as well and airports and everything. But obviously you find good people, you find complicated people, you find ignorant people along the way, all kinds of people. And our guest tonight is going to tell us about an incident that he had in a U.S. Airways express flight going from Philadelphia to Long Island. Basically, it was a few weeks ago, and it was involving Albert Rizzi, who is our guest tonight. He's blind, and it involves his service dog and what happened there. And so, thank you so much for being with us, Albert.
Oh, thank you, Salvador. I appreciate it so very much. Con mucho gusto.
That's a good Spanish. My pleasure, Albert. Can you please take us back to the day of this incident, to the flight? What happened?
It is still so hard to understand exactly what happened for me personally. But now it's almost 1 month ago. November 13th. I was making a connection flight from San Francisco to Long Island. I had just left the Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, where I'm working with the Intuit Corporation to make QuickBooks, the leading accounting software program in the world, accessible and usable for the blind and the print disabled. So I got on the flight, and immediately the lady, the flight attendant had said, "Oh, I wish I had known you were on the plane. I would have saved you the bulkhead seat." Now, a lot of blind travelers are always told where regulations and policies require they sit. I happen to like the bulkhead. It's my preferred seating arrangement, but that's not true for everybody. So she took me to the back of the plane. It was a very small plane. I don't think there were more than 45 seats. And in the back of the plane, it was much like a tour bus, if you will. The back seat went the entire width of the plane. And she sat me in the middle of the bench, and there are 2 rows of seats on either side, but no seat in front of me. So she insisted that before we took off, my dog, Doxology, who I called Doxy, needed to be under a seat. I told her, "I don't have a seat. What do we do?" She insisted, "We'll have to get him under a seat, otherwise the plane can't take off." The lady sitting next to me, Mary Comfort, who is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here in the States, offered her seat. So we put Doxy under the seat and waited to take off. 40 minutes later, we're still on the tarmac, and Doxy sneaks out to be close to me. Under my legs, his head is under my legs, and his hindquarters, his back end, is under Mary's legs. The flight attendant comes back and says the dog needs to be under the seat before we take off. So again, I'm like, okay, fine. We push the dog under the seat once again. And now we're on the tarmac an hour and a half.
Wow.
And she comes back and says it again, but this time with such a tone in her voice that I said to her, "Why are you being so evil?" And she said, "I am not being evil. If I were being evil, I would turn the plane around." So I was not happy with that, but I kept my composure. I told her I'm not going to get into an argument with her to give her grounds to throw me off the plane. So we need to deal with this. I don't have the tools to succeed. So I asked her to go back to her seat, the jump seat, and when we were ready to take off, give me a sign or a notice, and then I will shove the dog under the seat. We will take off. We will be in Long Island in 45 minutes, and this will be a distant memory. Instead of doing that, she decided to have the plane turned around. Now, we all thought the plane had mechanical difficulties. Nobody knew why the plane was on the tarmac for an hour and a half. Almost an hour and 45 minutes by the time she turned the plane around. We got back to the gate, and everybody starts calling friends and family saying we're not going to be able to be in the airport, blah, blah, blah. On comes a U.S. Airways official and says to me, Mr. Rizzi, let me help you off the plane. And I just assumed they were helping the poor blind person because, we can't walk off a plane by ourselves.
Right.
So I opened the overhead compartment. I got my things. And I got a very odd feeling that I was the only person getting off the plane. And it wasn't until I got to the doorway that I turned and said, am I the only person getting off this plane? And he said, let's talk about that inside. And I said, no, we're going to talk about it right now.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, please. Of course, that's the only time that I lost composure. And I used some harsh language and some colorful words to speak to this horrible flight attendant and walked off the plane and into the terminal. I'm very, very upset, Salvo. I travel no less than sometimes 10 to 15 times a year.
Wow.
This year alone, I traveled U.S. Airways 5 times. And a similar situation happened in May, 6 months before, where a flight attendant threatened to take me off the flight because he wanted paperwork for my dog. Now, I know Mr. Magoo doesn't get paperwork, but sometimes people think a dog's supposed to have paperwork, but we don't have to produce that. So inside we go, and I'm very, very upset. And his name was Lamar Brooks, a very wonderful, calm, the man was just had the spirit of God in him, just so calm to me, and said, Mr. Rizzi, I understand you're upset, but please stop yelling at me. I think I know what happened. So I listened. He turned to his colleague, Linda, and said, when I walked onto the plane, it was quiet. Everybody was very happy. The dog was asleep. There wasn't any commotion or disturbances that this flight attendant said was on the plane. And then, to make matters worse, there were 7 empty seats that she could have moved Mr. Rizzi to. So she was intentionally blind to resolving this issue, and I don't know whether she didn't like the dog, didn't like blind people, didn't like me. I still don't know. So I was sitting there very upset, and at the moment I heard Lamar say, oh my God. Now, Alvaro, I thought maybe they were calling the police and they were going to put me in handcuffs. So I said, what's wrong? And he says, everybody's getting off the plane. And everybody came in and said they're not going to fly with her. They wanted me on the plane with my dog, that everything she was saying was a lie. What I didn't know is that while I was inside the terminal being very upset, everybody on that plane argued with management, the pilot, and the stewardess, yelling about how wrong they were, how she lied, and how this was totally wrong. And because they were so upset, the captain said, we either fly now without him or we don't fly. And they all got off the flight.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. They came in the door, Alvaro, and I was so humbled. I felt so, in that moment, I felt so uplifted and so empowered that even though I was upset, I did not know what to say. I just stood there with tears in my eyes and people walking by, patting me on the back, saying, we're not going anywhere unless we go with you. Now, there was people on the plane. One of them, his name was Christopher. His brother is blind. So there were a lot of people on that plane from all walks of life who know people of all abilities, and all 35 stood up in solidarity and said, no, this is wrong, and we're not going to accept it. It was ridiculous. It was remarkable. And then we all got on a bus and drove 3.5 hours to New York.
Wow. I'm almost speechless because that, Albert, and for our listeners, that is the beauty of humanity. When people are willing to stand up for what is right, and when they are able to say, you know what, when something is wrong, we have to stand up together, united. And that's what they did. And that's what makes it wonderful for us when we have people around us that are humane, normal. If this happened to someone else, we would do the same, because that is solidarity. It's something that sometimes is being lost in our society.
Claro que sí. That is exactly right. And I think that is the message that I want everybody to walk away with. Because what I found out the day after this happened to me is that U.S. Airways was fined $1.2 million U.S. for doing the same thing to people in wheelchairs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a corporate culture there that doesn't respect the disabled, and we need to change that. Now, this week coming, I will be speaking in Washington, D.C. at the very first Airline Transportation Access Conference.
Oh, how nice.
And, it's a blessing. I keep telling you, Alvaro, that there's nothing, aside from the emotional stress that I felt, the gifts that keep coming from that experience really are helping My Blind Spot, which is my organization, and you can visit us at myblindspot.org, and we'll talk about creating accessible environments for people of all abilities in all areas.
Wow.
Remarkable.
I wonder, Albert, in general, in your trips that you have done these years, how has been in general the response of flight attendants and the crew of the airplanes and the airport personnel? How do you see that?
Well, thank you for asking that, because this is a unique situation. I don't believe that all flight attendants and all airline staff represent this woman, or that this woman represents them. Even with U.S. Airways, I go to the travel club, and I know all the people in Philadelphia. They see me when I come in. Oh, Albert, how are you? You want to sit by your usual seat by the bar? I cannot travel without a cocktail. But, so they're wonderful, and I've had wonderful experiences on Southwest, on United, but there is this sense that there are regulations and policies that don't really exist. I have been told that blind people with their guide dog must absolutely sit in the bulkhead seat, that is a regulation. That is not true. I have also heard that blind people with a guide dog must sit in a window seat, or that two blind people traveling as colleagues or as spouses cannot sit in the same row if they both have guide dogs. This is ridiculous. These things, what happened is, and this is the way I have felt since I was a child, is that the flight attendant or the stewardess has complete authority. And sometimes we don't question that authority. But there is, with Nelson Mandela passing, the kind of stand he took against authority that was wrong is the same thing we need to harness and use in the disabled community, just to say no. And we need to be respected and treated as, powerful and independent, valuable people. So I find that a lot of the flight attendants, for the most part, are very accommodating. And since 9/11, there has been an abuse of or misinterpretation of what could be a personality that could disrupt the flight. I'm not a terrorist, but U.S. Airways painted me out to be one, and they painted my dog to be a monster. And he's the most docile, calm animal I've ever met.
Oh, for our listeners, dogs are unbelievable.
Oh, they are.
Albert, from what you're going to speak in Washington, D.C. in this wonderful conference about accessibility in airlines and everything related to transportation, what do you think is the most important message for the industry?
I think the most important consideration for the industry is to come to a consensus. A unified policy, a unified regulation, a unified understanding of best practices that aren't based in antiquated myth and misperception. A lot of times we're going on people's mindsets from the 1950s and the 1960s before there was a disability movement. So I think it's very important for them to understand and hear that we need to follow the laws and understand what those laws are with regards to travel, and not use some proposed or purported policy or regulation to intimidate.
That's a very good message. And many of our listeners are travelers. Is there any specific recommendation for them if they travel with their guide dog specifically, if they should have any information before traveling, or they should ask anything to the airline before traveling?
Well, it's a very personal choice. I happen to self-identify as a blind traveler who uses a guide dog. This is why what happened is so confusing to me. A lot of my blind colleagues throughout the States and the world prefer not to. I do not suggest that that's the best way to go, because there's other people on board that need to be accommodated and made to feel comfortable, as well as the dog.
Sure.
So I would like to let people consider advising the airline of the presence of their dog. Always be polite. I'm always polite till they give me a reason not to. Always speak with an authoritative tone, but not a disrespectful tone, and challenge them to prove, if you have the time to make them hold the flight, challenge them to produce documentation that supports the regulations they're talking about, because those kinds of supports do not exist. So, and also just identify who your flight attendant is, ask for them by name, create that personal relationship with them from the moment you step on the plane. It's a lot nicer speaking to somebody by name, such as, Jean or Dion, than it is, Miss Flight Attendant or Mr. Flight Attendant. You make it personal. Make them respect you and want to be accommodating.
That's a great tip, Albert.
Thank you.
Just out of curiosity, because I love so much airports and everything, how do you deal with airports? Do you go with your guide dog and see where it takes you, or? I'm not that adventurous. It's a shame until we get accessible or audible signs or some other variation on a theme that allows me to independently walk from one terminal to the next. I always ask the flight attendant to get me a sighted guide or some assistance to get me to and from the gate. Only if the departing flight that I'm trying to connect with is 2 or 3 terminals away and requires 2 or 3 buses to get to. But I like to ask people for guidance in that respect, because since being blind, I lost access to the visual cues and signage that other people use to find their terminals and their gate. So I don't really feel it compromises my independence, but empowers it to be able to have somebody read signs and direct me toward my destination,
rather than sitting there hoping for the best as my dog is sniffing on leftover napkins or food that somebody dropped on the floor.
That's another good point. My last question for you, Albert, and it's something that I haven't prepared, but listening to you, I think it's important to give this message to people. But before I ask you, let me tell you a little story. I love New York City. I mean, New York City is like home to me, and our listeners know why. There's a lot of history there. Um, and in one of my trips in 2010, I was in the train coming from Rahway, New Jersey, and I was in Penn Station. And one of the train drivers came to me and said, "Would you like help to get off the train and go into the city?" And I said, "Sure, of course." So we go walking with Mr. Magoo and everything. And in the middle of the walk through Penn Station, who, well, is a very huge station, as you know,
Yes.
and he tells me, "Excuse me, but I have a question." And I said, "Okay." He said, "You seem to be very happy. Why?" And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, because you are visually impaired, you don't see much." And I said, "So?" and he said, "Well, my question is because many people that I meet who are blind in the city are not as happy, and they act very rude when you try to help them."
Absolutely.
And he told me, "I wish everybody would be with that kind of attitude of being happy instead of being so, oh my God, let me go my own way." So I want to
Amen.
ask you about that, Albert. What do you feel about that?
Well, I happen to agree with your surprise, and I happen to agree with the gentleman's interpretation. I find that some blind people tend to be very adamant about their independence as they're stuck in a corner trying to find a door. And I also find that in instances like you prefer and I prefer, we have a wonderful opportunity to educate people in the sighted community about how happy we are.
Oh, yeah.
And how normal we are. And regardless of whether he's seeing it as a blind issue, there are just miserable people of all abilities,
Sure.
sighted and unsighted,
Sure.
who just don't appreciate humanity. And I don't understand either how blindness got such a bad reputation. Think about it. We're all asked to believe in our higher power. We're expected to believe that God or whatever entity we believe in exists in blind faith. And then when we want to find that one person to spend the rest of our lives with, or a best friend, we call that blind trust. And then when we want to go to court and have decisions decided that we can't come to terms with between the persons that we're talking to, justice is doled out blindly. She's even wearing a blindfold, proving seeing is not believing. Believing allows you to see more clearly than ever. I've never seen more clearly as a blind person. Never, never, never.
That is a wonderful thought and very true as well. I agree with you, and we have to change that. And I have to add something that a famous singer in Spain that I interviewed for the Spanish version of LBB Show told me months ago. He said, when I was invited to a show, which is the most famous show in Argentina, and I was dancing for the show, and I was number 2 after the whole tournament, and people came to me and said, "Oh my God, you were second." And he said, "Yeah, so what?" And they said, "Well, but you're blind." And he said, "Yeah, I can walk too, and you can talk too." So
Well, Albert, it's so funny because I also competed in a taxi derby up here in Long Island We have a blindfold taxi derby where everybody in the driver's seat of a car is blindfolded, and they have a co-pilot.
Oh, wow.
And I took second place in that race.
Oh, wow.
And we did 5 miles and 50 miles per hour. It was wonderful. And, we are only limited by our own fear and our own belief in what other people say about our ability. And that's my biggest problem being blind, is that most people impose their fear and their misunderstanding of ability upon me.
Yes.
And it's just such a... Helen Keller once said, the only thing worse than being blind is having sight, but no vision.
Absolutely true, Albert.
Now, Penn Station, too, is a very daunting place, sighted or not.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And Doxy and I get out of that station without any sighted assistance all the time.
Oh, wow.
I never realized he was able to do that till one day I didn't have anybody on the train to talk to. And I said to him, okay, it's up to you, boy. And up the escalator we went, to the left, then up the set of stairs, another escalator, then to the left. And he took me right to my favorite taxi stand.
Unbelievable.
It's ridiculous. And when we talk about the tools we have before us to succeed, there isn't anything anybody can do. At My Blind Spot, we believe access to the right tools promotes ability and restores infinite possibilities.
Such a powerful interview, Albert. I'm really...
Oh, thank you so very much.
No. Before I let you go, please tell us, how can people reach out for you?
Okay. People can reach out for me at albert@myblindspot.org, or go to our website, again, myblindspot.org, all one word. And I would love to hear from anybody and everybody, because I'm looking to expand my network, learn from new people like you, my new friend from Colombia, who, when you come to New York, we better have dinner.
We better.
Yes, and I want to be able to travel to Colombia. I'm about to take my very first trip overseas since losing my eyesight. I think I'm going to Europe first.
Oh, wow.
But I'm definitely going to put Colombia on my places to visit, since I have a new friend there now.
How nice, Albert. And it's my pleasure also to be your friend, Albert, and being from New York and everything. That makes a connection with me easily.
Perfect.
So thank you so much for your time, and for our listeners, remember always to smile and always to be happy. Thank you so much for listening to LBB Show. This is Alvaro saying good night.